Welcome to part 2 of my video series on Ken Richardson. In the previous video, I covered my motivation for reading this guy's books, my initial impressions, and why his argument that IQ is a measure of social class is not substantiated. After publishing my first video, Race Realist and another guest blogger have written a series of responses to which I wrote a series of short responses in return, link in the description. I may do a more comprehensive response to criticism video in the future. Anyway, in this video, I'll be covering one of Richardson's other main contentions, that everything we think we know about IQ testing is actually a consequence of test construction. This claim interlocks with his claim that IQ is a measure of social class. If you accept the idea that everything we think we know about IQ testing is designed into the test from the beginning, it becomes much more plausible that IQ tests do not in fact measure anything that could be reasonably considered to be intelligence. According to Richardson, test construction is responsible for the predictive validity in terms of correlation with education and occupation attainment, that IQ subtests correlate with each other. He blames test construction for the lack of sex differences, the presence of race differences, that IQ falls on a normal distribution, and that intelligence increases throughout childhood and then levels out around age 18 to 24, then declines thereafter. There's practically nothing about IQ that this guy doesn't blame on test construction. As we'll see, most of these claims do have a small grain of truth to them. Each of these properties were present in the first IQ tests without any evidence of engineering these properties in to begin with, but some of these properties were certainly tweaked or enhanced through test construction. However, these grains of truth fall far short of supporting the large and sweeping claims regarding test construction he makes throughout the 2 books and 1 article I'm referencing. The most significant claim is that IQ tests don't predict anything because the correlations are baked into the cake in a sense by test construction. The firmest leg that IQ has to stand on is its predictive validity, so we'll start with that first. His basic thesis is represented in this figure from his book, The Making of Intelligence. The idea is that teachers rank students and how good they are at school-type stuff. Then the IQ test constructors test a bunch of items and swap and shuffle them until the scores correspond to the teacher's rankings. He describes this process of, quote, working backward, figuring out by trial and error what type of tests produce the desired pattern of scores. Richardson seems to imply that this is done on all IQ tests, especially when considering this figure. But if you read carefully, it seems what he is actually claiming is that the first IQ tests developed by Alfred Binet and his assistant were developed like this, and then IQ tests that followed, such as the Stanford Binet and Wechsler test, use similar types of test items, therefore inheriting the built-in correlations. To quote Richardson, this pragmatic procedure using a backward strategy for arriving at a test that predicts school attainment is the essence of the Binet method, and it has characterized IQ test construction ever since. Also, quote, Terman devised 40 additional items to form the new Stanford Binet test, which has since, over several revisions, become the standard IQ test. The other most popular test, the Wechsler scales, were broadly based on the kinds of items that have been found to, quote, work in previous tests. Richardson makes no explicit claim that the Stanford Binet, Wechsler tests, or Raven's matrices tests used any process of swapping test items to agree with teacher assessments or anything like that. It's a bit unclear to me exactly what his claims are, so I'll try to assess his claim on the original Binet-Simon test, as well as the original Stanford Binet, Wechsler-Bellevue scale, and Raven's progressive matrices. One of Richardson's frequently cited sources, IQ and Human Intelligence by Nicholas McIntosh, explicitly addresses the claim that IQ test predictive validity is a consequence of test construction. To quote McIntosh, why should there be such pervasive correlations between IQ and educational attainment? A skeptical answer might be that the correlations were built into the tests. IQ tests were constructed precisely with the requirement that their scores should correlate with educational attainment, and therefore included items that simply measured educational attainment. This is a common criticism, part of which has a certain plausibility when one thinks of such items as the arithmetic subtests of the WISC or Stanford Binet, but it will hardly do as a sufficient explanation. Binet's dismissive attitude towards teacher judgments should make it clear that he did not go about the business of test construction by carefully selecting items that would agree with him. Nor is there any reason to suspect that Raven's matrices were carefully constructed with this end in mind. To double-check McIntosh's assessment of Binet's writings, I purchased a compilation of Binet's writings on Kindle, spanning from 1905 to 1911, translated into English. I found many examples of what McIntosh is referring to. Here's a few. I wish to know what teachers think of their ability to judge the intelligence of children. At my request, M. Below, primary instructor of Paris, agreed to send his teachers a small questionnaire in which he requested information upon the two following points. First, what do you think is the proportion of errors that you have committed in estimates that you have made of the intelligence of your pupils? Second, what are the methods which you employ for arriving at an exact estimate? The replies elicited by these questions have been numerous, in the neighborhood of 40 very verbose, some forming a veritable memorial of 8 to 10 pages. The primary inspector, in delivering them to me, remarked that I had found an excellent means of classifying the intelligence of certain teachers. Among the number were certain very confused studies, and also pages where a devout optimism was curiously displayed. The teachers believed they were never deceived. And again, to quote Binet, all such teachers seek, more or less successfully, to make an estimate of the intelligence of their pupils, but they have no method, and in the normal schools the courses in psychology are generally so antiquated that one cannot learn how to observe mental phenomena. Primary school inspectors have often told us of zealous teachers who have had the ingenious idea of composing psychological portraits of their pupils, and we have looked over these collections of portraits with interest. We have congratulated and encouraged the authors without telling them frankly what we thought, which was that they were working without method, like a very intelligent but unscientific man who would try experiments in bacteriology with unclean tools. The broader context of both of these quotes was that a more scientific method of assessing the intelligence of students was needed, but also it's undeniable that he did not trust teachers to make objective assessments as to the intelligence of their pupils, therefore making the notion that he would carefully select tests to agree with their judgments quite unlikely. But perhaps the best refutation of the notion that Binet was selecting tests to match teacher assessment of students are the writings of Elizabeth Kite, who translated many of Binet's papers and was extremely familiar with his work. According to Miss Kite, quote, "The method of procedure of Binet and Simon for the standardization of the tests was to take only those children who were following the right grade for their years in school, and who were neither specially brilliant nor specially dull in their class. The condition was also added that the children selected should be within 2 months of a birthday. The final standardization was made upon hundreds of school children divided into groups of from 20 to 40 for each age. The given question was retained as suitable for the age at which the majority of the children answered it correctly, provided those of the preceding age had largely failed in the same question. In the long process of experimentation, numerous tests were given, many of which first seemed desirable were finally dropped, either because they were cumbersome or proved not to be sufficiently distinctive of a given age or were otherwise unsatisfactory. New tests were continually being tried and either accepted or discarded as experience justified." So indeed there was a trial and error selection process similar to what Richardson was describing, with one crucial difference. The ranking of children as the input to the process was by age only, not teacher assessment. The only subjective criteria by which the children were selected is that they were as average as possible for their age, and they were within 2 months of a birthday. There was no ranking of the children among the age groups provided. There is no evidence anywhere that Binet was using subjective teacher assessments and then engineering his tests to reflect that. He developed some of his very early experimental work by testing normal children versus retarded children, but the bulk of his experimentation, creating, testing, and dropping tests was based purely on age. Before moving on, I'll try to address a counter-argument I might receive from Race Realist. He has a blog post from November 2019 titled "The History and Construction of IQ Tests." In this article, he includes this figure from Richardson's book that I just showed you earlier. In close proximity to this, he includes this table from Alfred Binet's book, The Development of Intelligence in Children. He prefaces this section with the following. In The Development of Intelligence in Children, Binet and Simon discuss how teachers assessed students. The clear implication here is that Binet is presenting how teacher assessments were collected in order to feed into Richardson's hypothetical algorithm from this figure. The inclusion of this table is misleading. This table in the discussion preceding is from a chapter titled, "How do Teachers Judge the Intelligence of Their Pupils?" The context of this chapter is very important. It begins with Binet recounting how one of his colleagues of, quote, very superior mind, but was also a high-level administrator far removed from the detailed work he was engaged in, reproached him on the matter of his intelligence scale, declaring that, quote, all teachers know how to judge the intelligence of their pupils without difficulty. So Binet spends the rest of the chapter recounting his experience with teachers and their evaluation of their pupils. The first of the Binet quotes I covered just a few minutes ago is from this very chapter. Binet acknowledges that teachers have an advantage over his test in terms of their ability to observe pupils over a long period of time, but he notes how the longer the teachers observe pupils, the less sure they are of their intelligence, in terms of ranking them from smartest to dullest. On the very next page following this table, Binet says of their observations, quote, But on the other hand, what indecision in the observation, what errors? One rarely arrives at a certainty and never at a measure. Binet notes that after throwing away all the obviously fallacious methods that teachers use to estimate the intelligence of their pupils, some of them used methods that were a rough approximation of the method used in his intelligence scale. Quote, "One can see that the teachers practiced very badly a very good method." Binet concludes the chapter by essentially saying that teacher assessments aren't completely worthless. His own method, the Binet-Simon intelligence scale, is slow to administer and isn't always practical when teachers have 60 or 80 pupils in a class. But he also claims the superiority of his method, calling it a quote, "deluxe method," or translated into English, deluxe, meaning a superior method of measuring a child's intelligence. All of this is a long way of saying that he wasn't using teacher assessment to guide the construction of his scale in any way. Even for the most intelligent and insightful teachers he worked with, he considered their methods inferior to his intelligence scale. The entire purpose of this chapter was to counter those that would claim teachers could judge the intelligence of their pupils just fine without his test. The next test I'll cover is the Stanford Binet, which was constructed and standardized by Louis Terman. For brevity, I'll describe the procedure he used for constructing the test rather than quoting him directly. Link in the description if you want to check my work. Terman revised the original Binet-Simon scale by taking 1,000 children between ages 5 and 14 and within 2 months of their birthday from an average social class school where nearly all the children in the district attended. Using a long process, they eventually settled on a combination of Binet's original tests and 40 new tests. The combination of tests was carefully selected for every age until the average IQ score for each age was approximately 100. They then took the IQ scores of all 1,000 children and divided them into 3 categories: IQ 90 or less, 90 to 110, and over 110. Each test item was evaluated on how well it could discriminate between the 3 groups. Of Binet's original 54 tests and Terman's 40 new tests, 4 tests were discarded, leaving the total number at 90. Keep in mind, this process was evaluating the tests against the test itself. No external validity measures were introduced. No new test items were added by this process, but a relatively small percentage were eliminated. To extend the test beyond 14 years old, a small number of adults of various ages were used that were pre-selected in terms of some criteria of intelligence. This included businessmen, unemployed men, adolescent delinquents, and unselected high school students. But again, no teacher ratings were used, but there is a degree of subjectivity in predetermining which people from age scale 15 to 18 were intelligent or not to construct the test. So you could argue that item selection for those over age 14 were based on how well they discriminated between groups of predetermined intelligence. However, in the very next revision in 1937, actual 15 to 18-year-olds were used instead of adults, and subjective measures of intelligence were no longer required. The 1937 revision of the Stanford Binet also added new tests, but once again, no teacher ratings or other subjective measures of intelligence were used to select the new tests. For the initial process of selecting test items, the items were evaluated for their ability to discriminate between different levels of mental age from the original 1916 version of the Stanford Binet test. As with the Binet-Simon scale, there is no evidence that subjective ratings of intelligence, from teachers or otherwise, were used in the item or test selection process for the Stanford Binet, with the possible exception of adults in the original 1916 standardization. So this brings us to the Wechsler tests. The Wechsler-Bellevue test was first released in 1939 and was advertised as an intelligence scale applicable to children as well as adults. Later, the test was revised and separated into the WAIS, or Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and the WISC, or Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, largely using the same types of tests but standardized at different levels of difficulty. I was able to locate an online copy of the book Measurement of Adult Intelligence 3rd edition, which also includes a description of the procedure used to construct and standardize the Wechsler-Bellevue intelligence scale. All subsequent revisions of the WAIS and WISC were based on this scale. Of the 4 different IQ tests I researched for this video, the Wechsler-Bellevue was the only one in which Richardson's thesis could be argued to have any empirical support at all. Wechsler claimed to use the following criteria for selecting tests. In arriving at our final choice of tests, we pursued the following procedure. Number 1, a careful analysis was made of the various standardized tests of intelligence now in use. These were studied with special attention to authors' comments with reference to the type of functions measured, the character of the population on which the scales were originally standardized, and the evidence of the test's reliability. Number 2, an attempt was made to evaluate each test's claim to validity as evidenced by its degree of correlation with other recognized tests, and more important still, with subjective ratings of intelligence. The last named included teachers' estimates, ratings by Army officers, as is the case with the Army Alpha and Beta, and estimates of business executives in the case of various tests which have been tried out in industry. Number 3, an attempt was made to rate the tests on the basis of both our clinical experience and that of others. And number 4, some 2 years were devoted to preliminary experimental work of trying out various likely tests on several groups of known intelligence level. So despite the mention of evaluating tests against subjective ratings of intelligence, including teacher ratings, as well as the 2 years of experimental work trying out tests, I would still argue that this procedure does not support Richardson's thesis. The main reason being that the Wechsler tests did not introduce new types of tests. It drew from existing test types from other intelligence tests and then evaluated them using the above criteria. In fact, to quote Wechsler, our aim was not to produce a set of brand new tests, but to select from whatever source available such a combination of them as would best meet the requirements of an effective adult scale. And Richardson seems to agree, quote, the other most popular test, the Wechsler scales, was broadly based on the kinds of items that have been found to work in previous tests. New types of items, especially nonverbal or so-called performance items, have been devised in the same pragmatic way, with little improvement in theory about cognitive processing to guide it. If you read Wechsler's summary of the types of tests they settled on for his scale, he tells you where they originate from, except in the case of arithmetic. The reason I emphasize the type of test is that Richardson's thesis makes it explicit that the reason IQ tests correlate with academic achievement is that the test items are academic in origin, and that children's relative preparedness for these types of tests is highly influenced by social class. Every IQ test is of course standardized on a large population of different ages, and a part of this involves swapping various test items within the same test type of varying difficulty. Surely if something like block design were easier for upper or middle class children versus working class children, selecting particular block design test items based on difficulty wouldn't alter this class-based rank order as described by Richardson. Each test item is still probing the same essential characteristic in the child, whether it be intelligence or, quote, socio-cognitive affective preparedness for IQ testing. Now, of course, it cannot be ruled out that some of the test types were constructed around subjective intelligence ratings. It also seems plausible that Wechsler's test selection procedure may have screened for tests that did have these properties. Fortunately, Wechsler provided some validity information, including comparisons with the Stanford Binet that could help answer this question. Wechsler conducted a study of his test's IQ scores versus teacher assessment for high school and trade school students. He found a correlation of 0.43 and 0.52 respectively. Lewis Terman performed a similar study on the original 1916 Stanford Binet and found a correlation with teacher assessment at 0.48. So the two scales give similar correlations with regard to teacher assessment. But what is also interesting is how highly these two separate scales correlate with each other in terms of raw IQ score, despite the fact that the Wechsler tests share less than half of its subtests in common with the Stanford Binet. Wechsler did his own study and found a correlation of his test with the 1916 Stanford Binet at 0.82. In this table, he summarizes correlations found in other studies with both the 1916 and 1937 Stanford Binet. The studies using college freshmen show somewhat lower correlations, but this is probably due to restriction of range. The studies that have larger samples with less selective populations show correlations in the 0.8 to 0.9 range. These correlations are especially impressive considering that the test-retest reliability of the Wechsler-Bellevue is about 0.94, which is in some sense the correlation of the test with itself. So what is this data telling us? First, it is unlikely that the Wechsler-Bellevue was tuned to match subjective intelligence ratings such as teacher assessment because it scores no higher on that metric than the 1916 Stanford Binet, which, aside from ages 15 to 18, was based purely on age, as previously discussed. But even that caveat is trivial, since the 1937 Stanford Binet, which was standardized purely on age, correlates with the 1916 version at greater than 0.88 for 13 through 18-year-old children specifically. And second, the extremely high correlations of the two tests with each other suggest that they are measuring something in common, making it unlikely that the similar correlation with teacher assessment is just a coincidence. If each of these tests are indeed measuring something similar to what we might call intelligence, it would only make sense that the teacher assessments would be a rough proxy, as indicated by the correlations in the 0.4 to 0.5 range. So to summarize, although Wechsler's test construction procedure does seem to match Richardson's thesis at first glance, it did not create new test types as would be required in this hypothetical procedure. It's possible that some of the test types that Wechsler selected were created in this way, but the external validity with teacher assessment suggests that the Wechsler-Bellevue was no more calibrated with teacher ratings than the Stanford-Binet. At this point, I can confidently say that I've probably researched early IQ tests to a greater extent than Richardson, because if he'd ever read Wechsler's paper on the development of the Wechsler-Bellevue scale, he would have certainly used some quotes from it. And finally, this brings us to Raven's matrices. I included Raven's matrices in this survey because it's still one of the most well-known IQ tests, and is mentioned by Richardson, as we'll get to in a moment. All the available evidence I could find points to Raven's matrices being based on cognitive theory, however ill-defined, rather than any kind of working backwards strategy. Raven's matrices were designed around Charles Spearman's theory that one primary manifestation of the G-factor is essentially the, quote, adduction of relations, meaning that it tests people's inductive ability to formulate rules from a set of observations. In Raven's matrices, you're given two instances of a set of rules in action. You then must reason out what those rules are from the given information, as well as discard irrelevant information, and use the rule set to determine the missing piece in the third row. Richardson makes it fairly clear that even he doesn't think Raven used any kind of working backwards theory to construct his test, to quote Richardson. The author of the test designed items on the basis of intuitive judgment, what seemed to him to be measuring adduction. The broader context of this quote is that he's criticizing the theoretical approach used to develop the test, but in doing so he acknowledges that no, quote, working backwards selection of tests were used. So that pretty much covers the external validity aspect of Richardson's test construction claims. As we'll see, many of his other claims regarding test construction are dependent on this claim that the predictive validity of IQ tests are just an artifact of test construction. As I've just covered, this claim cannot be supported by a detailed review of the relevant evidence. The next claim of his I'll cover is regarding the G-factor. Richardson also suggests that at least part of the reason IQ subtests correlate with each other is due to test construction, or due to test constructors themselves coming from a narrow social class with their own intuitions about intelligence, and so on. To quote Richardson, as in the construction of tests themselves, you don't get what you see, you get what you want to see. What is perhaps most remarkable in all of this is that investigators are surprised that performances on such tests are correlated at all. The items are, after all, devised by test designers from a very narrow social class and culture, based on intuitions about intelligence and variation in it, and on a technology of item selection which builds in the required degree of convergence of performance. The ultimate test of this hypothesis would be to construct an IQ test with extremely low subtest correlations that still had significant predictive validity. I'm sure it will come as a shock to the viewer that Richardson points to no examples of such a test. We already know that this has been attempted by Louis Leon Thurstone. Thurstone believed that intelligence is best described as separate and independent mental faculties, and he invented multiple factor analysis in part to demonstrate this. However, he soon realized that every test he devised correlated to a significant degree with his other tests, despite his best efforts. He even went so far as to devise, quote, oblique factors that were not entirely independent of each other to get around this issue, but then it was found that the oblique factors could be factor analyzed themselves, producing a hierarchical G-factor. Thurstone eventually admitted that Spearman's G-factor was an unavoidable aspect of mental testing, and he later incorporated it into his models. To quote Thurstone, there seems to exist a large number of special abilities that can be identified as primary abilities by the factorial methods, and underlying these special abilities there seems to exist some central energizing factor which promotes the activity of all of these special abilities. And again, to quote Thurstone, it seems likely that a second-order general factor derived from correlated primaries may turn out to be Spearman's general intellective factor G. Richardson mentions Thurstone and his belief that intelligence could be separated into independent faculties in his book The Making of Intelligence, but gives no hint at his failure to do so. See my video, Stephen Jay Gould is Wrong About the G-Factor, for a detailed overview of Thurstone and the G-Factor. Probably the most well-known contemporary theory of a multifaceted theory of intelligence is Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. However, all attempts to actually implement a battery of tests based on his theories show that 5 of the 8 intelligences are highly correlated with each other, and individual differences in performances on these tests are best explained by the G-factor. The remaining 3 intelligences may in fact be distinct, but it's also possible that existing methods of testing for them are not reliable enough. It's also possible that something like intrapersonal intelligence is better represented by a Big 5 personality trait. I will concede that IQ tests are engineered to increase the subtest correlations, such as in the case with the 1916 Stanford-Binet, where they eliminated subtests that didn't show a correlation with the rest of the test. But the fact is, in any diverse set of tests that have any kind of face validity or predictive validity, Subtest correlation is inevitable, and no one has succeeded in producing a test that eliminates these correlations, despite a tremendous amount of effort expended to do so. To quote Arthur Jensen, "If someone wants to prove that G is a psychometric artifact of the way tests are constructed, let them construct a battery of individually reliable mental tests whose matrix of intercorrelations does not yield a G factor. This has been tried assiduously without success. Attempts merely to lower the G loadings of a test have shown the test's external validity is therefore seriously impaired." And to quote Charles Murray, "For more than a half-century, the holy grail of psychometrics was a set of statistically independent primary mental abilities. Careers were consumed in the search. No one succeeded." For a detailed history of the debate over the G factor, the first 100 or so pages of Human Cognitive Abilities, a Survey of Factor Analytic Studies by John Carroll is an excellent source. Richardson implies, but is careful not to state so directly, that the lack of sex differences in IQ were not discovered, but rather engineered through test construction. This claim has a small grain of truth to it, but I would argue that it still deserves a mostly false if I were running a fact-checking website. Lewis Terman was the first to examine sex differences. Overall scores of the original 1916 Stanford Binet found very little difference. Individual tests found some moderate level of difference, but some favored boys while others favored girls. Overall, they mostly canceled each other out, leaving girls with a small advantage over most of the age range. No adjustments were made to the scale, the differences were merely noted. My analysis on this point is corroborated by Nicholas McIntosh in his book IQ and Human Intelligence. It should be clear, therefore, that IQ tests were not designed from the outset to yield equal scores for the two sexes. Terman thought he was making an empirical discovery in 1916, and whatever the generality or validity of his conclusion, he was surely right. Unless he and Weschler were carefully concealing what they were up to, their initial tests discovered that there were no more than trivial differences in overall IQ between the sexes, and that such differences as there were favored women. However, in the 1937 revision, which added some new test items, tests that were found to have very large differences were eliminated. Weschler said he did the same. I think it's worth noting that Weschler thought women were probably smarter than men to a small degree. Quote, "We have more than a sneaking suspicion that the female of the species is not only more deadly, but also more intelligent than the male." Richardson takes this one fact, that the 1937 revision eliminated tests that showed large sex differences, and draws large implications from it. It was an accidental outcome of the first Stanford Binet test that boys tend to score a few points higher than do girls. At the time of the 1937 revision, it was debated whether or not this difference should be allowed to persist. It was concluded that the differences were due to, quote, "experience and training," rather than, quote, "native ability," and so it was duly eradicated by the appropriate selection of test items. This is, of course, a clear admission of the subjectivity of such assumptions. It is in this context that we need to assess claims about social class and race differences in IQ. These could be exaggerated, reduced, or eliminated in exactly the same way. That they are allowed to persist is a matter of prior assumption, not scientific fact. In all these ways, then, we find that the IQ testing movement is not merely describing properties of people, rather the IQ test has largely created them. I selected this quote to highlight how Richardson tends to take one design consideration from one IQ test and uses it to anchor much larger and broader claims than this one piece of evidence can possibly support. But before we can even talk about that, I need to clean up the errors he makes in the above quote. First of all, as I've already covered, the sex differences in the original Stanford Binet favored girls, not boys. Girls outperform boys by a few IQ points from age 5 through 13, except for ages 10 and 13 in which they appear to be identical. Boys exceeded girls only at age 14. More on this in a moment. Also, sex differences in the 1937 revision were not eliminated. They identified a few tests in the initial trials that showed large differences, and those tests were eliminated as, quote, "probably unfair." The test still showed sex differences, favoring girls at the younger ages and boys at older ages, especially above 13. The fact is, the first draft of these tests showed very small sex differences to begin with, and then in later revisions, test items that showed large differences were eliminated, slightly reducing the already small differences. Overall, the lack of sex differences was discovered, but it could be argued this was an accident of the type of tests included in the Stanford Binet. It appears that men and women have different strengths and weaknesses, whether innate or through social conditioning. So one question comes to mind: if IQ tests were in some sense a reflection of the worldview of the test constructors, why would women score as well, or in many cases better, than men? When the first IQ tests were developed, women weren't even allowed to vote. What kind of patriarchy is this where women, who were predominantly relegated to the status of housewives, more intelligent on average than men? Lewis Terman, creator of the Stanford Binet, said as much himself. Quote, "The question as to the relative intelligence of the sexes is one of perennial interest and great social importance. The ancient hypothesis, the one which dates from a time when only men concerned themselves with scientific hypothesis, took it for granted the superiority of the male. With the development of individual psychology, however, it was found that as far as the evidence for mental tests could be trusted, the average intelligence of women and girls is as high as that of boys and men. One indication that the tests were more reflective of reality than the bias of the test constructors is the interesting change in the small boy-girl IQ gap with age. Girls seem to outperform boys on the Stanford Binet up through age 13, at which point the trend seems to reverse. It is an indisputable fact that girls mature faster than boys. I'm sure we can all recall around age 11, girls were on average taller than boys, despite being 6 inches shorter on average by adulthood. Women generally finish puberty by age 16, whereas boys finish by age 18 on average. It would seem that early IQ tests discovered this discrepancy in maturation speed rather than constructing it. So as we just covered, Richardson claims that gaps in IQ between races can be, quote, exaggerated, reduced, or completely eliminated through selection or deletion of tests. No example of such a test that accomplished this is provided, of course. The first thing to note is that if no backwards working strategy was implemented to construct the test, it greatly diminishes the plausibility of existing observable racial gaps being an artifact of test construction. So I agree that the gaps could be increased or decreased, at least regarding the black-white IQ gap, but reducing it to 0 without completely breaking the test itself is probably not possible. There's 2 reasons why. The first is that IQ scores have approximately the same predictive validity for whites as they do blacks. If you hold IQ constant, most measurable racial disparities vanish. In fact, all the evidence shows that IQ tests currently overpredict black performance slightly. If you were able to produce a test that eliminated the IQ gap, it would massively overpredict black performance. The only way to reconcile this would be to postulate some pervasive X factor that depresses black IQ scores to the same degree that it depresses socioeconomic outcomes. And no, simply saying racism is not a scientifically acceptable argument. You need to show evidence of trait-relevant mechanisms that are motivated by racism. The second reason has to do with the pattern of subtest scores between black and white Americans. The black-white gap is not constant across IQ subtests. In fact, the subtest gaps are larger on subtests that are highly G-loaded and smaller on tests that are less G-loaded. You could vary the black-white gap by deleting subtests from the Wechsler test, for instance. If you delete the lower G-loaded tests, the gap would go up. If you delete the higher G-loaded tests, the gap would be reduced. It has been shown that for extremely G-loaded test batteries, once you remove G, the predictive validity of the test is completely destroyed. To quote Arthur Jensen, because population group mean differences are closely related to the test's G-loadings, there have been innumerable attempts to reduce test G-loadings in the hope of reducing the size of group differences, most notably the mean black-white difference. This can be accomplished to some degree by including in the battery more subtests with only moderate G-loadings. The price paid for doing this is diminished external validity. We can easily determine the effects of a complete removal of G from a test battery by partialing G out of the test's validity coefficient, leaving non-G factors and test specificity as the sole predictors. The typical result is validity coefficients that are so close to 0 as to have no practical value, and this is true regardless of the external criterion. The fact is, G is the active ingredient in IQ tests. If you remove G, the test becomes worthless. And blacks and whites differ the most on subtests that are highly G-loaded. There's no way to reduce the black-white gap to 0 without completely breaking the test. I want to emphasize that this is true whether or not the black-white IQ gap is partially due to genes or 100% due to environment. The fact that blacks and whites differ most on subtests that are highly G-loaded is an empirical observation and could very well change over time. So there are 2 tests I'm aware of where blacks do outperform whites, the quote Chitling test and the hilariously named bitch test. So evidently the bitch test stands for Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeneity. As far as I can discern, these 2 tests were developed just to prove a point, that the cultural differences between American blacks and whites is so great that a cultural test of black quote ghetto vocabulary could be devised where blacks would greatly outperform whites. Indeed, according to Wikipedia, in the original sample of 200 students that took the bitch test, blacks scored 87 out of 100, whereas whites scored 51 out of 100. Fortunately, we do have some validity information on the bitch test. It correlates at negative 0.04 with the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale and negative 0.33 with the level of education in the black sample specifically. So, basically 0 correlation with the WACE and a moderate negative correlation with education. One wonders what kind of, quote, backwards working strategy the test constructors used to engineer such politically incorrect measures of validity. When I wrote the first draft of the script for this video, I conceded that IQ tests are indeed constructed to fall on a normal distribution, but that it really doesn't matter. Nothing that is claimed about IQ would be necessarily invalidated if this were true. But as with every other topic I investigated concerning test construction, to my surprise, this wasn't true either, or that it only had a small grain of truth to it. The truth is that neither the original Binet-Simon test, nor the original Stanford-Binet, nor the original Wechsler-Bellevue test were constructed to fall in a normal distribution, yet all of them approximately turned out that way. So in reality, nothing in nature falls exactly on a normal distribution. For instance, here's a frequency distribution of height of Englishmen from 1939, with a normal curve with the same mean and standard deviation plotted over it. Height isn't exactly normal, but it's close enough such that no one really claims that human height deviates from a normal curve to any degree worth arguing about. So, using human height for comparison, here's the frequency distribution of the 1916 Stanford-Binet, the 1937 Stanford-Binet, and the 1939 Wechsler-Bellevue standardization samples. Not exactly normal, but pretty damn close. The Wechsler test has an obvious skew to the left, but so does human height, though admittedly to a lesser degree. And again, none of these tests were designed to fall on a normal distribution. As Arthur Jensen points out in his book Bias in Mental Testing, quote, "The simple fact is that a test unavoidably yields a near-normal distribution when it is made up of 1. A large number of test items, 2. A wide range of difficulties, 3. No marked gaps in item difficulties, 4. A variety of content or forms, and 5. Items that have a significant correlation with the sum of all other item scores, so as to ensure that each item in the test measures whatever the test as a whole measures." The first 4 points are all extremely practical considerations when designing a test, and the existence of the G-factor ensures that the last consideration will be true to some degree. So if you consider that proof that test construction yields a normal distribution, fine, but it seems to me far from an artificial outcome as implied by Richardson. Richardson mentions the normal distribution to attack IQ testing in 2 separate ways. The first is that he argues that whatever biological mechanisms in the brain are responsible for whatever we define as intelligence, they are unlikely to fall on a normal distribution. He cites several measurable attributes of the brain and nervous system that fall in clearly non-normal distributions, but since no one knows exactly what IQ tests are testing at a root biological level, I don't find this argument very compelling or even very relevant. The only other context in which he brings up the normal distribution is something he can point to which seems to be undeniably a result of test construction. In both books, The Making of Intelligence as well as Genes, Brains, and Human Potential, he makes the exact same move. He makes his point about test items being selected to match prior assumptions, and then pivots quickly to scores falling on a normal distribution as an example of forcing this artificial outcome on the test. Note that these are 2 completely separate claims. You can force IQ scores to fall on a normal distribution through test standardization and selecting items of empirically determined difficulty. This has nothing to do with the selection of test types or items to align with subjective rankings of intelligence. So I think he believes he can bolster his case about everything regarding test construction by anchoring it to something seemingly undeniable as the claim that IQ tests are artificially forced onto a normal distribution. I have no doubt that modern IQ tests are probably designed this way with item analysis, but to what degree is this really forcing an artificial outcome when the first IQ tests ended up with approximately normal distributions by accident? As previously mentioned, Richardson also claims that the apparent age differences in intelligence are again the result of test construction. To quote Richardson, another assumption adopted into the construction of IQ tests is that, as a supposed biological measure like strength, it will steadily increase with age, leveling off after puberty. This property has been duly built into the test by selecting items on which an increasing proportion of subjects in each age group passes. Of course, there are many reasons real intelligence, however we define it, may not develop like that. In the case of the IQ test, however, the assumption had produced the undesired and unrealistic effect in which scores improve steadily up to the age of around 18 years and then start to decline. So first, it is absolutely true that items were selected such that an increasing proportion of subjects in each age group passes. This is because the first IQ tests were age scales. With regard to intelligence tapering off at puberty, this seems to be another empirical discovery that Lewis Terman stumbled upon rather than something engineered into the tests. Terman discusses the age increase in intelligence in some depth in his 1937 paper regarding the Stanford-Binet test, especially regarding how quickly it develops at different ages. Another characteristic feature of the mental age unit is that its magnitude shrinks as mental maturity is approached. The difference between 1-year and 2-year intelligence is far greater than that which separates the average 15-year-old from the average 16-year-old. The former difference is so large that it is obvious to anyone, the latter so small that it is barely detectable by the most elaborate mental tests. Probably not one 12-month-old child in a million has a mental age of 2 years, but almost half of the 15-year-olds have a mental age of 16 years or over. Insofar as it can be judged by the overlapping of adjacent age groups, it would appear that the shrinkage in mental age unit proceeds gradually rather than irregularly. For example, the number of 3-year-olds that test at 4 is approximately equal to the number of 6-year-olds that test at 8, or 9-year-olds that test at 12. This suggests, though it does not prove, that the mental growth between 3 and 4 years is about the same magnitude as that which occurs between 6 and 8, or between 9 and 12. For both the 1916 and 1937 Stanford-Binet, they struggled at developing tests that could distinguish between 15 through 18-year-olds. Both revisions basically treated these mental ages as adults. Yet from the Binet-Simon 1911 test and every test since, they had no trouble distinguishing between, say, 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. The Wechsler-Bellevue scale showed a very similar trend. A definite leveling off of standard score increases is very apparent at age 15. This chart, also from the Wechsler-Bellevue paper, shows the growth and decline of mental ability. It shows that scores finally peak around age 24, then start to decline. There is no mention anywhere in the text relating to either scale of any kind of expectation of this occurring, or fine-tuning their test to achieve this result. Terman clearly would have preferred a test that cleanly segregated average children of all ages, yet they struggled to achieve this beyond about age 15. There is one significant thing that early test constructors got wrong, that IQ declines rapidly after about age 24. However, this wasn't due to test construction, it's because they had no way of knowing of the secular increase in IQ scores, otherwise known as the Flynn effect. Nicholas McIntosh discusses this in his book IQ and Human Intelligence, noting that longitudinal studies where they follow up on the same people over time, giving them IQ tests as they age, indicates no significant IQ decline until after age 60. There is some evidence that fluid intelligence does indeed decrease, whereas crystallized intelligence stays the same or increases over age. But the fact is, it seems overall IQ does not significantly decline until much later in life. When using cross-sectional analysis, it just seems that way, due to the 3-point per decade increase in IQ scores over time. So in conclusion, a review of the early IQ tests do not support Richardson's broad generalizations that these various properties of IQ tests were designed into the test from the beginning, although most of these properties were certainly tweaked through various design considerations. The very first IQ test, the Binet-Simon, was not designed using subjective measures of intelligence, therefore its predictive validity cannot be considered an artifact of test construction. The 1937 Stanford-Binet was not designed this way either, and has served as a standard by which subsequent IQ tests are judged. All attempts at designing an IQ test with predictive validity that does not yield a substantial general factor have failed. The lack of sex differences and presence of race differences were discovered, with no evidence at biasing the test to achieve this result. The first IQ test yielded approximately normal distributions, despite no attempt to do so. And since the first IQ tests were age scales, of course age differences were built into the test, but the gradual tapering off as children approach maturity was also discovered, not due to any design considerations. Of course, it's possible that there are some IQ tests out there that were designed exactly as Richardson claims, down to the very last detail, but that would prove nothing in general, since all of these properties emerged organically from the first IQ tests. Some of Richardson's claims could be empirically demonstrated, such as producing a useful, predictively valid IQ test that didn't yield a general factor, or didn't yield race differences, or yielded large sex differences, or had children of various ages scoring approximately the same. Some of these have been tried and have failed every time, as far as I can tell. If a viewer can point me to some evidence of such a test, please post it in the comments. I spent quite a lot of time and money to research this video, including all the books I purchased. If you'd like to support my channel, I'm accepting donations via Bitcoin. You can find my address in the description. Also, please share my video, as that's the primary way I get exposed to new viewers. Whenever I see a small bump in subscribers, I can usually trace it down to somewhere the video was shared, not to any organic growth on YouTube. I may eventually do a part 3 to this series on heritability, but that will be an even larger undertaking than this video. So stay tuned for my next videos where I do a response to criticism and I take a look at Sean's video on the bell curve.